All right. Go ahead and grab a seat, and we'll get going with week 2 of this Explore God series. If you're new, my name is Chad. I'm the lead pastor here, the teaching pastor here, and we are super glad that you have joined us today. We're in week 2 of this series that we are doing with hundreds of churches around the Bay Area. I forgot to mention this last week. There are churches all over the Bay doing the same series called Explore God this fall, really designed to help you explore big questions of life and faith in a fresh way. And today we've come to a rather big question. I mean, kind of the idea of the series is they're all big ones, but this is a big one. The question this week is, why believe God exists? And I'll set it up for you this way. When I was growing up, I spent an entire summer trying to dig a hole to China in my backyard. Anybody else ever try this? Okay, I'm really glad I'm not alone. That could have been a very vulnerable moment for me. I don't know where you got the idea from. I think I saw it on an episode of Looney Tunes or something. And so I just got it in my head that if I could dig deep enough, I'd come out the other side and enter a whole new world. And if I really wanted to go big and be romantic about it, I could say I was searching for Karen because she spent her summers going to China growing up. But if I'm honest, it wasn't romance. I was a kid. I was just looking for adventure. And so I thought, dig, and adventure will pop out the other side. And so I went out there day after day. I'd eat my breakfast in the morning. I'd head out there, grab my shovel, and I'd start digging. And then I'd go inside to eat lunch, and then I'd go back out there and keep digging. And then my mom would come home from work and be like, get in here. And I'd have to wait till the next day to continue my journey along. And I didn't realize until years later why my grandfather, who basically raised me, I didn't realize, why would he let me go on with this delusion for so long? I didn't realize it until I became a parent myself. And then I realized, that was free babysitting, baby. Right? You've got the kid contained in a hole, not going anywhere. Unless something falls in, he'll be fine. And so he's off enjoying a drink, having a good time. I look back on that, I'm like, smart guy, my grandpa. And I bring all of that up because maybe you believe that faith in God is kind of like that. Especially after last week, where we said last week that, the purpose of your life, the purpose of my life, the purpose of all of our lives is to love and to bring more love into the world. And we said last week, hey, good news, there's actually a God who can help you with that. And maybe you hear that and you go, man, I wish that were true. Just like you wished you could dig a hole to China, golly, wouldn't it be nice? But maybe you think that's as scientifically improbable as my journey to China was going to be. And the question I want to ask you this morning to consider is it really? I just want to ask you to have this open posture that's willing to look at this question afresh. I think we all walk in here with ideas, but I want to just consider for our time together this morning, is it really that improbable? Because for centuries, philosophers and scientists have been discovering dozens of pieces of evidence that point to the existence of God. And I think as rational people, we want to follow the evidence wherever it leads, right? Okay, good. I was like, I'm a rational person. I assume we're Westerners. You're probably rational. Some of you are like, my spouse isn't rational. Don't go there right now. But seriously, as rational people, we want to follow the evidence where it leads and not just blissfully dig our hole away to China, totally disconnected from the facts, but we want to be dialed into those facts because digging a hole to China is cute when you're a kid. It's concerning when you're a grown-up. And so what we want to do this morning, what I want to invite you to do is take a fresh look at it. And I said there's dozens of pieces of evidence. I'm going to boil it down to 2 for you. So here's my plan this morning. We're going to look up at the stars. We're going to look inward at our hearts. And then I think we're going to see some good news in all of this I don't know, you tell me, find me after service, you let me know. And before we get into that, though, I want to do a quick giveaway, because I said there are dozens. I'm going to give you 2, but there's other proofs, and some of them are so interesting that I wanted to include them today, but I'll be real with you, I don't have the skill, I don't have the time, but it's probably more that I don't have the skill to go through them. And so I want to give away a book that a pastor buddy of mine wrote. In this book, he tackles some of the things we'll say today, but he also gives 2 proofs for God's existence that I thought were really fascinating. He talks about a proof from math and a proof from music. And so I'm not even going to touch that in this sermon. Gavin's done a great job here. Anyone into math? I'm straight up going to give these away if you like math. Okay, Phil, can you run this to someone in the back? I see hands back there. If you're into math and you're exploring, this is really cool. And if you know me at all, you'll be like, good call, Pastor, not trying to make the math argument for God. That is not my wheelhouse. But if it is yours, it's really good. Anyone into music? Anyone not yet on our worship team, but you're like, hey, that's kind of my world. I like playing music. I'm exploring God. Anyone into music? All right, Phil, this is also secret auditions for the worship band here. Could you run this? I didn't even prepare them. Thank you very much, Phil. Okay, with that said, math, music, there's so many good proofs out there. We're going to look at what have classically become 2 of the main ones. We're going to look up at the stars and inward at our hearts, starting with what we can ascertain from the universe around us. Listen to how King David said it. This is in Psalm 19. He writes this: "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge." Now, what's fascinating about that to me is the entire scientific process is built on that assumption right there. The universe has knowledge to reveal, and if we would use our senses to observe that knowledge, to observe the universe and what it is revealing to us, then we can learn true things about reality. The entire scientific process rests on that assumption. And I point that out because maybe you've been told that to be a Christian, you have to be anti-science. And I just want to present, I actually think it's the other way around. That if you want to be a good scientist, you actually have to borrow assumptions from the Bible. This is why so many of the Nobel Prize winners, if you look through history, were Bible-believing Christians. Because it's not like you have the Bible on one side and science and they're fighting each other, but when rightly understood, this is a pro-science book that's going to give you the assumptions you need to hang in this academic area over here. And so what I want to do for a minute is let's just chat about what science can tell us about reality as we observe our universe, because that's what Scripture's telling us here, that the universe, as we observe it, can tell us something about God. It is a settled scientific fact that our universe began with the Big Bang. Now, if you are a Christian and that makes you nervous, I just want to breathe out for a minute. Let me tell you something my grandpa said to me growing up that I thought was just brilliant. He said, God said it, and bang, it happened. All right, so breathe out. It's okay to laugh. It's like all of this stuff, according to Psalm 19, that you can observe out there with telescopes and science, all of it's going to do service to reveal the glory of God, so we don't have to fear this stuff. What science is telling us is that at some point in long ago, whenever that was, I ain't getting into that argument today, but whenever that was, the universe began with an explosion, and out from that came life. And for a long time, scientists believed that the Big Bang was inevitable. That basically, if you give it enough time, it was just going to happen eventually. If it didn't happen at this point, it happened a couple of years later. But the idea was you don't need God for a Big Bang. It was just kind of a statistical probability that given enough time, eventually it would happen. And yet what's interesting about that is the more that we study our universe, we now know that life could only emerge under a series of very specific conditions. And if any of those conditions were off by the slightest degree, life as we know it would be impossible. Let me give you one example. So physicists have discovered something called the gravitational constant. This is the figure that's at the root of the equation that determines the force of gravity everywhere you go. So planet Earth, moon, Mars, all of that gravity, you know how that's different? It's all determined, though, by an equation that has an unchanging number. That's the gravitational constant. The gravitational constant is one of the laws of physics that governs our universe. And what scientists have discovered is if the gravitational constant were off by even 1 part in 10 to the 60th power, the universe would have either expanded too rapidly after the Big Bang, so stars wouldn't have time to form, planets wouldn't be able to bring forth life, like nothing would exist. It just went too fast. You went too far in that direction. If you adjust it 1 in 10 to the 60th degrees to that way, well, then, man, the entire universe would collapse inward on itself. And so, again, I'm not telling you Christian unique thoughts. This is everyone that can look out and observe. This is uncontroversial. If the gravitational constant were off by more than 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, life as we know it would have been impossible. Could have never developed, could have never happened. And I don't know how you hear that number, so I actually threw up a slide here. Some of you are visual. That is 1 in 10 to the 60th power. That's 1 with 60 zeros after it. If that number were off by any one of those, we're all done. Life never happened. Now, I said earlier I'm not competent at math, and it's totally true. I cheated my way through high school math. I'm just being real with you. And so, when I look at that wall of numbers, that means nothing to me. Anybody else, I don't know what that means. Is that our national debt right there? I don't know. So I actually enlisted the help of some friends who are much smarter than me to try to visualize, to try to wrap my mind around this number. And so maybe this will help you if you're like me. If you were to cover the entire continent of North America in quarters, like this, that would take you 10 to the 17th power quarters, which is a lot of quarters. I looked it up this week. That would actually pay off our national debt. So some of you are like, we should all convince everyone to put a quarter on the ground, see what happens. I don't know, not terrible. There are definitely worse ideas. But 1 in 10 to the 17th power still gets nowhere near the number we're talking about earlier. And so what my friends were saying is, you know what, if you stack those quarters, like that pile of quarters going all the way across North America, if you were to stack that entire thing all the way up to the moon, how many quarters do you think that would take? 10 to the 28th power. 10 to the 28th power. You could stack quarters across the entire continent of North America and all the way to the moon, and you're still not even halfway to our number. So check this out. Maybe this will help you. If I were to paint this quarter blue, and I were to put it in the pile somewhere, and I threw a blindfold on you and threw you out there, spacesuit and all, do you realize the odds of you picking up this 1 quarter that I painted blue are twice as good as the odds of the gravitational constant being set within life-permitting range? Isn't that nuts? And look right at me. That is just one of more than a dozen such constants that scientists have identified. I'm giving you one. When you put the odds of all of those together being dialed just right at the same time, the numbers get so absurd that you begin to come to the conclusion that life is not a statistical probability, but an improbability so absurd it would be irrational to chalk it up to chance. Now, don't take my word for this. Listen to how atheist and great astrophysicist Fred Hoyle says it. I point out that he's an atheist. Some of you are like, truth is truth is truth. I just want you to know, I'm not quoting you our team here. I'm not quoting you a bunch of biased people that are going to make an argument that supports the Bible. I'm trying to give you the best and the brightest. And so Fred Hoyle, famous great astrophysicist, he was so stringent in his belief that there is no God, he actually mocked Stephen Hawking, thinking that guy borrowed a little too much from page 1 of the Bible. So just so you know where this guy's coming from, when he looks at all this, here's what he concludes. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. And he's not the only one. I was watching a discussion this week between Richard Dawkins and Steven Weinberg, which, if you're not familiar with those names, these guys are kind of like the C.S. Lewis and Tim Keller of atheism. One is a biologist, one is a physicist. These dudes are brilliant. They are sharp as a tack. I'd have to watch it on you know how sometimes you speed up videos like 1.5? I had to slow it down to 75% to go, what? These guys are brilliant. They've written more books than most of us will ever read. And they got into talking about the miracle of our universe. And they're not using that miracle. I want to clearly say who's saying what. They're just talking about everything I've been telling you so far. The gravitational constant, how improbable it seems that life could ever develop in our universe. And Steven Weinberg says to Richard Dawkins, speaking about all this, he says, it really only leaves you with two options. Either there's a benevolent designer, or we're living in a multiverse. Now, as you can imagine, these two guys had a good chuckle about the whole benevolent designer thing because they're super committed atheists. But once they get over laughing at that possibility, they start talking about the multiverse and how maybe there's an infinite number of universes. And so as absurd as the odds look in one universe, if you can have an infinite number of universes, you can eventually get to where it's rational. And I'm watching this going, these guys have watched way too many Marvel movies. What in the world? But as I continued studying, as I continued asking my friends, hey, give me the best of what you got out there, what I learned is this is actually forefront thinking among atheist physicists and biologists and people who think seriously about the universe. Is kind of the leading theory to explain everything I just showed you is we must be living in a multiverse. Let me give you, if you haven't seen the Marvel movies, let me give you a quote from Sam Harris, another famous and brilliant atheist who can help you understand the concept of the multiverse. He says, in a multiverse, you have a universe in which everything that is possible is in fact actual. Everything happens an infinite number of times. So again, the idea is, hey, look, as irrational as the odds would be to happen in one universe, if you had an infinite number of universes, well, then it brings the odds down, and eventually, everything that could happen, happens. And so eventually a universe would come along like ours, and it might be 0.001% of all the universes, but eventually it happens in one of them. And then in all of the universes in which life happens, do you realize that in a multiverse, listen to Sam Harris, everything that could happen, happened. So that means there's a universe out there in which Tupac's still running around alive, making music. Some of you are like, that's this one. No, it's not. That means there's a universe out there where you studied abroad, and after that semester, you just stayed out there and never came back. There's a universe out there where you have purple hair, and just think about every choice you have ever considered. The multiverse theory is saying, if it could happen, it happened. There's a version out there where I preach this sermon in under 40 minutes. We'll see if we're living in that one. And on it goes. If it could happen, it will happen. Or in the words of Sam Harris, everything happens everywhere. That's one way you could explain the science. Or you could say, the skies reveal the glory of God. That the complexity of our world reveals that there's a beautiful mind behind it all that has set this place up to flourish for life. And you don't have to believe in an infinite number of universes. We're talking one God who is so good that he could set it up on the first try, just as it needed to be. Now you tell me, which one of those options sounds like the more rational one? I mean, maybe you're thinking, both of those sound crazy to me, Pastor. But that's actually kind of my point. That life is a miracle, and if you don't like that word, find another word. Life is statistically improbable. There's no way it could be by chance. And so whatever your explanation is, you have faith in something that you cannot see. Whether it's an infinite number of multiverses or a singular God, you have faith in something you can't see. The question is, what are you going to have faith in? Now, maybe you're like, well, golly, I think I'd prefer the multiverse. Well, don't worry, that's just my first point. Now, I want to shift from what science can tell us to looking at ethics and kind of looking under the hood of our life and seeing, is there something inside of us that could tell us something? Because this is where I think it gets really interesting. Let's see here. All right. Who's glad the science lesson is over? My people. All right, thanks for hanging with me. Okay, let's shift now to talking about morality. So C.S. Lewis was a famous atheist in the 20th century. Brilliant writer, brilliant professor, brilliant thinker. I mean, this guy was a brilliant everything. If you're new to church, we quote him almost every other sermon. So here's your quota for the week. C.S. Lewis, when he became a follower of Jesus, he wrote a book called Mere Christianity, kind of explaining the reasons he believed why a rational person would want to believe in God. And here's how he opens his book. He says, everyone has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny, and sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant. But however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kinds of things that they say. They say things like this: how'd you like it if someone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was there first. Leave him alone. He isn't doing you any harm. What interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He is appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play or decent behavior or morality or whatever you like to call it, about which they really agreed. What he's saying there is the second that you and I say that there is a right and a wrong, that it is wrong to steal, that it is wrong to drive 10 under in the left lane, that it is wrong to hurt people and to abuse children and to abuse women. Like the second that you say things like this, you are appealing to some objective morality that we believe bears its weight on all people everywhere. What's interesting about this, though, is it only seems to bear its weight on humans. This is why nobody calls the police when a lion tackles a gazelle and eats it for breakfast. Right? Like we film videos about this. We make movies and we go, circle of life, baby. Look at that lion go. But if I were to come up to someone in the lobby after service and start looking at him like the lion does when he sees the gazelle, and start beelining for that person and grab him by the neck, throw him to the ground and eat him, you wouldn't say, well, he was hungry. No, you would say what? You're fired, yeah. Because that is wrong. And the question becomes, where do you get that idea from? Why is it wrong for me, but not for the lion? What's so different about us? Here's how the Bible would answer that question. We read this in Romans chapter 2, verse 14. It says, indeed, when Gentiles, those are people who are far from God, outside of church, no interest in knowing, following, believing in God, when the Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature the things required by the law, they are a law for themselves. Even though they do not have the law, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times defending them. Now, so much we could say about those verses. You might have noticed they're in parentheses, because it's taking place in a much larger argument in the book of Romans, which I hope to preach, Lord willing, at some point in the future. But what's going on there is one of the first followers of Jesus, a guy named Paul, is writing to a church, and he's saying, like, you think you're so impressive for, like, knowing what the right things are? He's like, even people who are far from God share the same basic moral compass as you. Don't see it as some achievement that you know what's right. How are you living? And so he's pressing them on that point. He's making this point. So this verse is sometimes misinterpreted and misunderstood to say you have to be a Christian in order to be moral. Not at all what he's saying. In fact, he's saying the opposite. That Christian or not, Jew or Gentile, regardless of your religion or your worldview, when God created you, he stitched this moral compass into you. He knit it into the fiber of your very being. And so regardless of what you believe about God, you should expect to see a similar moral compass shared across all of humanity. Which is exactly the thing we were just talking about that we see. And I don't know about you, but I look at that and I go, I tend to think that's one of the best arguments for the existence of God, that there is some sense of right and wrong that all humans, regardless of where they're born, what they're taught, tend to believe deep and down. And you could find the little parts where we disagree, sure and fine, but there is a base level of agreement that, historically speaking, is shocking that all humans tend to share this basic sense of right and wrong. I think that's a powerful evidence for the existence of God. Because it becomes all the more powerful when you think about the alternative. So think about this. If there was no lawgiver or God or, what did Weinberg say, a benevolent creator, then why do all humans seem to have this law written on their heart? If we're all just highly evolved animals, where did we get our sense of right and wrong from? And why do we have it, but the lions don't? This is a question I've asked my atheist friends. Like, hey, give me the best guys and gals you've got on this one. I want to read the best that you've got, because I'll be real with you, I think this is the point where the atheistic worldview just crumbles. I don't see an answer that's workable here. You could go full Marvel on point one if you really want to. But I'll tell you this, is I have read and listened and explored how could you answer this question about this kind of universal moral compass apart from God. Here's the two answers that I have seen. And I'm telling you, if I'm missing something, grab me after service, find me, connect me to the primary source. Like, I'm not trying to present a straw man here. Find me after service. Here's the two I tend to hear. Maybe you've heard some of these. So number one, sometimes you'll hear people say, your moral instincts aren't real. So they're based in the culture in which you were raised. So the idea is you were brought up in this culture, and so the people that brought you up taught you to think in a certain way. And so that's why you believe things are right and wrong. Not because it's objectively true, but just because that is how you were taught to think. And so for example, there are some cultures that value timeliness, and there are other cultures that value being present with people. And what's funny about that is, like, people from both cultures tend to marry each other, right? Like, I know when I was dating Karen, I learned that showing up on time is being late. And so I had to adjust my morality accordingly, because I came from a tribe that it's like, if we get there within 10 minutes, we made it. Right? And so, like, okay, surely it's true on some morally neutral things, like how on time you are and how present you are. I would readily admit some of the values we hold are socially conditioned. But that cannot explain our deepest moral impulses, because think about it. If it is true that all of our moral instincts are only a product of culture, only a product of the relationships and the people around us, if that is true, then you and I have no grounds on which to stand up against the evils and injustices in our culture. Because the whole point is, well, if that's what the culture likes, then who are you to tell them? If there's no real right and wrong, who are you to tell that group over there that they like, that it's wrong to like this skin color instead of that skin color? Right? Like if all of our morals are just socially developed, then where do we get off telling other countries that women are equal to men? What if they don't think that? Who are we to say? I'm realizing someone's going to clip me out of context right now. I do believe men and women are equal. I do believe those things are wrong. My point is simply that if you are saying that all morality is socially conditioned, then at that point you lose the ability to critique the injustice in any society, because that's how it was conditioned. And so, realizing how unworkable that is, that I would say is the popular argument. You will not find a lot of serious atheists making that argument. That's like what you're going to hear on the street. People will say that. And I don't say that to offend you if you walk in here thinking morality is socially conditioned. I just mean I can't find a lot of books with footnotes arguing that. But it's there. Here's the one that you will read a lot of in academia. Number 2, your moral instincts aren't rational. Those are my words, but let me explain. I was watching another Dawkins interview, and he was asked by the interview, what's the purpose of life? And his answer was, the purpose of life is to propagate your genes. Which I know a lot of teenage boys that think that. But like most of us grow out of that eventually, right? That like life is about more than sex and just getting it out there. But this was his answer. It's like survival of the fittest. You got to keep going. So he gives his answer, and the interviewer reacted kind of like you did just now, like, that's the purpose of life? And so she kind of presses him on it. It's not a hostile interview. I don't know her beliefs, but she kind of presses him. She says, but so much of what we value runs contrary to that goal. And surely much of what we value is unrelated to that, but like it actively runs against that. So for example, if the purpose of life is to propagate your genes, then you would want to sleep around with as many people as possible and have as many chances for survival as possible, right? And you wouldn't want to help out anyone else's progeny because they're going to be a threat to yours. This is the thinking. But as a culture, don't we tend to value faithfulness? Don't we tend to value serving people of other races and other cultures than us? And so she starts asking about this, and his response is fascinating. I want to read it to you. This is what Richard Dawkins says as she's pressing him on this. He says, I've often said that whereas I'm a passionate Darwinian with respect to why we exist and why we came to be the way that we are, I'm a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to things like personal feelings and political philosophy. In other words, what he's saying is he has all these deep moral instincts that are directly at odds with his view of the world, which is Darwinism. And so he believes that Darwinism explains the purpose of our life. It's answering the big questions. It explains how we got here. And yet, his own worldview cannot make sense of the deepest moral impulses he feels. So much so, if you read any Dawkins, he'll use this term again and again and again. He'll say, I'm un-Darwinian. We should build an anti-Darwinian society. And I'm like, then maybe you shouldn't be a Darwinian if you think the society would be so wicked and evil. And I know it sounds like I'm critiquing him. I get so passionate about this because as I've studied this man's work, like I have so much respect for this dude. He is so sharp. He is so curious most of the time. That as I was listening to him, it's whenever he gets into talking about ethics and morality that I wanted to jump through the screen and be like, aren't you the least bit curious at the fact that your life's work and your worldview is at odds with the deepest parts of you? Like, doesn't that disconnect bother you? And so I know he'll never see this, but I got you here. And so I want to ask you that question. If you don't believe in God, then where does your moral compass come from? And does your existing worldview make sense of that? Or is it kind of one of those things you're like, I don't know why I feel that way, but I do? If that's where you're at, I'll be real with you. I respect you so much that you would want to live into moral impulses you don't understand. Because Paul's whole point in Romans is like, well, dang it, believers don't even live into the moral impulses that they do understand most of the time. So I think there's so much commendable about that, but I would just ask you, like, aren't you the least bit curious about that disconnect? Like, aren't we trying to be rational here and use our minds to understand the world around us? If your worldview cannot make sense of the deepest parts of you, then I wonder if it might be time for a new worldview. I'm not saying your worldview should explain every little thing. Like, I believe in Jesus, not math. That's why I didn't do the math thing earlier. I don't understand all of math. But I am saying that I do believe that your worldview should be able to explain the most important parts of you. And if you can't explain why you love and want to be faithful to the people in your life, if you can't explain why you want to care for people outside of your tribe, if you can't explain why it's wrong for a strong person to devour a weak person so that the strongest survive, if you can't explain those basic things and yet you deeply feel them with every fiber in your being, then might it be that you're the one who thinks you're digging a hole to China? Again, I don't say that to offend you. I say that because I love you. Like if you're here and you're exploring God, I so respect the journey that you're on. I think it's so much easier to just go through life and literally bury your head in the sand. And to just keep doing what you're doing as long as it works until your life comes crashing down around you. And maybe that's why you're here today. I don't know why you're here today, but if you are here for whatever reason, I respect the journey that you're on. I think something's at work in you that you would even ask these questions. And so because I genuinely respect you, I just want to have some real talk with you this morning. What I have found in my own journey is that sometimes the barrier isn't here, it's here. Sometimes I can rationally see what is true and yet still want to keep digging my hole to China. Because the thought of reckoning with what I know rationally out there seems unimaginable. And I think deep down, we tend to have this sense, like as a pastor, I talk to so many people, and I have an honor of walking with so many people through their journeys. And my observation about humans is sometimes the issue isn't here, it's here, because deep down, I think a lot of us tend to have this belief that if God is real, it's not good news for my life. And so look, we've looked up at the stars above, we've looked inward at our hearts. I want to give you one more proof of God's existence, because I think this is the one that can free you up. We've looked up at the stars, inward at our heart, and I want to take a moment to just end this message by looking at Jesus. John, one of Jesus' disciples, he wrote this about Jesus. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. And so what he's saying is, you know the God we've been talking about that must have set the universe up? You know the God that stitched things into your heart? He's saying, hey, that's the Word, right? The Word is the one who set the universe up with all of its complexity and beauty. And then skip down to verse 14. He says this, the Word became flesh and has made his dwelling among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And so why should you believe God exists? John would say from his own testimony that you should believe God exists because Jesus came. And Jesus is the Word. He is God come in the flesh. And look, I know You may have so many questions about Jesus. You probably have so many questions about Jesus. I promise we'll get to them in this series. I just for today want to leave you with John's claim. John says that Jesus is the truth you are looking for. He says, you want to understand God? Look to Jesus. In him, the fullness of God came and dwelled among us. You want to understand your life and what it means to be human? You want to have some understanding of these desires and these impulses you have deep down? Look to Jesus. And if you flinch at the mention of his name, I'm so sorry for the things that have been done to you. I know we Christians can sometimes give our Jesus such a bad name. And so, man, what I want to say is don't look at the Christians, look at the Christ. Because what John says about Jesus is that even more than all of the truth and wisdom and light he can bring to your life, he is full of grace. He's full of grace and truth, not one at the expense of the other, but one does come first in the order of priority. He is full of grace and truth. And so look, I don't know what comes into your mind when you think about God, but if you're thinking of a crusty old man sitting up in heaven, just kind of annoyed with you, kind of disgusted at the things in your life, having a laundry list of all the things that you better clean up if you're going to get on his good side. If that's your idea of God, I don't believe that God exists either. We're on the same team here. I don't think that God makes sense of our reality. But if you look to Jesus, I think you'll find what John and so many others have found. A God who loves you and is so crazy about you that he would form this world in such a way where life could form and he could think you up. That he would set up the laws of physics so that you and I could flourish. That he would knit our bodies together just as they're intended to be, with everything about them, including the moral impulses deep down, so that at a natural level, whether or not we ever get a Bible, we would know how to bring goodness into the world. God thought you up for a purpose, and he loves you. This is the God we see in Jesus. And he's not just full of all of that truth in life, he's full of grace. And so that God didn't just write a book from heaven and drop it down on us. He came down into our broken world where we violate our moral compass, where we violate one another. And he went to a cross and he bled and he died so he could take away that sin and rise us back to the life he intended for us. And I'm telling you, if there's even a chance that that kind of love is real, I think you owe it to yourself to explore that. And so as we take some time to respond to this message, here's the invitation I would make to you. If you're here and you're exploring God, like I can only imagine how your mind's swirling right now. I would invite you, if you're at all curious about this, as we take some time to respond, to just, in your own heart, say to Jesus, hey, if you're real, I'd like to know. Man, if in you is the fullness of life, yes, please, would you reveal yourself to me? And gosh, if he's revealed himself to you this morning, like I want to invite you as the band comes up and we sing this next song, we're going to have people up here that will pray with you. We would love to pray with you and invite you to give your life to Jesus and say, Jesus, let's do this new life thing. Let's go. We have people that would love to pray with you. And so come forward. We'd love to pray with you if that's where you're at. Man, if you're a Christian and you've prayed that prayer and you know you have eternal life in his name, here's what I would say. My heart for you this week has been, it's so easy to get arrogant and argumentative about this stuff. And my great fear in preaching this sermon is that we would use proofs of God's existence to checkmate other people. I sense that in my own heart that like, man, I want to get me out of the way and to lift the truth high. And so if we have any shot of being good news people that go and say, look to Jesus, look to Jesus, look to Jesus, I think we have to come to Jesus this morning and realize that our future and our life is not dependent on the political climate getting in line with this truth. It is simply dependent on Jesus being on his throne and coming to make all things new, and that's what we celebrate with the bread and the cup. And so if you've trusted in Jesus, I want to invite you to come forward as we sing this last song and take the bread and the cup and remember the hope in which we believed, in which we're being saved by, and which will be delivered on the last day. So I guess what I'm saying is, regardless of how you walk in here, let's come to Jesus in the next few minutes. Wherever you're at in your journey, take some time to respond to Jesus.